How much longer will you forget me, Yahweh? Forever? How much longer will you hide your face from me? How much longer must I endure grief in my soul, and sorrow in my heart by day and by night? How much longer must my enemy have the upper hand of me? Look and answer me, Yahweh, my God. Well, hello there. I was just doing a reading from the book of Psalms. It's actually Psalm 13, and it's called a lament psalm. It means it's a psalm of sorrow. Some of the psalms are happy. They're psalms of praise and thanksgiving. But actually, more often than not, what we have is called lament psalms. The book of Psalms is from the wisdom literature, which in Hebrew is called ketuvim. You might recall that at the beginning of the year we learned the word ketuvim. Wisdom literature is something that's actually in the Old Testament, but just because I don't usually get to it until later, I like to do it at the end of the year with New Testament and kind of like roll it in with Jesus and Christianity, because it's Psalms and Proverbs. Unfortunately, of course, we're not at school, so we're just going to have to go ahead and do it at home as you've been doing other things. So I'm going to ask you to look at the 7 books of wisdom literature. That would be Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Sirach, and Wisdom. And there's going to be an assignment with this, so all of this, of course, will be on Plus Portals. The interesting thing about wisdom literature is that other than the book of Psalms, it oftentimes doesn't mention God. The Psalms are, of course, prayers. They're very emotional. They're poetic. They're meant to be sung, but I'm not going to sing for you. Okay? But sometimes wisdom literature doesn't really mention God very much at all. So here's another piece of wisdom literature that has been put to song. But it really doesn't talk that much about God. It's a reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And it goes something like this. There is a season for everything, a time for everything under heaven, a time for giving birth, a time for dying, a time for planting, a time for uprooting what has been planted, a time for killing and a time for healing, a time for knocking down and a time for building, a time for tears and a time for laughter, a time for mourning and a time for dancing, a time for tearing and a time for sowing, a time for keeping silent and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. That you might recognize the words to that. It actually was used in a song in the 1960s, a very popular song called Turn, Turn, Turn by the group called the Byrds. It's also a really great reading to use for funerals. But if you'll notice, it doesn't mention God. Wisdom literature is actually words of advice. That's just what it is. It might be poetry, it might be song, but other than the book of Job and, again, Psalms, most of wisdom literature is not really that religious, which kind of makes it attractive for people who are, again, not very religious. But it's still great advice on how to live your life. So with the assignment, you're going to be looking at the 7 books, and I'm just going to ask you to take some time to look at those and try to pull out a quote. I'd like you to look them over prayerfully and slowly and find a couple of quotes, and there's some space on the paper to do that. Before you do each of those, just a 1 or 2 sentence description. Now you can use almost any source, any online source to look at that. Please try to put things in your own words, of course. Also in your Bibles, usually at the beginning of the book, like if you go to the book of Wisdom and look at the beginning, there's probably an introduction there, and you can kind of learn a little bit about what that book is and what it's about and why it was written and when it was written. Again, just a couple of lines, and then look for a quote. And this is a way to kind of get an understanding or a feel for wisdom literature. One of the kind of favorite books of wisdom literature, because again, it's advice, it's words of advice, is the book of Proverbs. It's couplet after couplet of wisdom, and I'll just do a few for you now just so you can kind of get a feel for it. The fear of Yahweh is a life-giving spring for eluding the snares of death. To oppress the poor is to insult his Creator. To be kind to the needy is to honor him. The wicked man is overthrown by his own malice. The virtuous find shelter in his integrity. A mild answer turns away wrath. Sharp words stir up anger. The tongue of wise men distills knowledge, but the mouth of fools spews folly. They almost sound like something you get out of a fortune cookie. And again, other than mentioning the Creator, you'll notice that they don't really talk a lot about God. So sometimes when I'm trying to get people who are not real religious to read the Bible, I will start with something like the book of Proverbs or some other wisdom literature. So again, this is words of advice. You don't have to necessarily be religious. It is in the Bible, but some of it is not really necessarily Jewish in nature, but it's used by Jews and Christians and people of all faiths. And I'd like you to just spend some time with that. Again, look at the assignment. It'll be on Plus Portals. There's also going to be a PowerPoint on Plus Portals that has some quotes. Please don't use those quotes for yours. I'd like you to look through the Bible and find some other things. And just prayerfully flip through there and see if you can get a feel for wisdom literature. This is the last assignment that I'm going to be giving you before the final. I'm going to try to do a non-traditional final, and I'll be getting back to you on that real soon. So again, this assignment, you're not going to be able to use your textbook for this. Find a Bible, use online sources, and I hope you can gain some wisdom by looking at the wisdom literature. Stay safe.